This is part 2 of the lecture on the bug assignment. And if you remember, this is the assignment where we're visualizing the bug walking along the x-axis on an xy grid with our y coordinate more or less being 0. So we're not worried about y, we're just moving horizontally, either to the right or to the left on the on the x-axis. So I talked in the other recording about how to set up the class file and how you could set up your instance variables and how you could signify right versus left. And so what I want to do is focus a little more on the whole turn. Turn does not move the bug, it only has it face a different or opposite direction from what it's facing. And so in my program, I made the assumption that right is going to be a 1 and left is going to be a -1. And so I wrote a little if statement. If the direction equals 1, they're facing right, turn them left. Left is signified by a -1. If they're facing left, which is signified by a -1, then turn them right. Now, because I am totally in control of the value that will go into direction, I am not in any way allowing direction to be manipulated by the user through data entry. I am not allowing any type of method other than me, the programmer. My methods can change direction, but I'm not allowing that user to manipulate that here in main. I'm not allowing them to tell me right or left. I'm totally in control of the values and direction. And assuming that I am a competent programmer and I remind myself right is 1, left is -1, so I know I will never be allowing any invalid values like the letter A or the number 5 into direction because I am in control. In theory, I don't need to make that an else if. I can just make it an else. Because if it's a 1, if they're facing right, they need to face left. Otherwise, the only other thing that can be possible is they're facing left. Direction is a -1 and I want to flip them to facing right. So that's one thing I want to tell you. Since user entry is not involved in this, since I, the programmer, am totally in control, I can ease up a little bit on that if statement and just do an if else. Now, if I were allowing the user to determine the direction, I would have to make this much more involved because I would have to say if it's a 1, else if it's a -1, else if it's anything else it's bad data and I need to force them to somehow enter a 1 or a -1. But that was not a requirement of the assignment. So that is one thing I wanted to show you that you could do. Now, another thing you can do for direction that's even simpler than an if-else statement. Let's think about this for a minute. If my direction is a +1, I'm facing right, I want to turn them to the left. What if I multiply +1 times -1? I get a -1 as my answer. In my program, -1 means left, and it will make direction -1, so whatever their position is, I'll subtract 1, and I've moved to the left. If they are facing left and direction is a -1 and I multiply -1 times -1, I will get a +1, correct, in direction. That means that I have turned them right, and then when they move, they will have position +1. So that's an even quicker way to easily figure out right or left. And we can go back to our program here in main and we can run it and verify. Oops, I forgot to uncomment my code. So now I can run it and I still get my correct answer. Okay, so again, that's a little more sophisticated way of doing it. That might take you some more programming experience before you start thinking of shortcuts like that. Again, if I had used, say, 0 for left and 1 for right, that wouldn't quite work, and that's just experience. One of the reasons I chose 1 and -1 was my ultimate goal was to get you to a point where you could just have this one line of code here to flip the direction. But again, that comes with experience. That's not something you would necessarily do as a new programmer. So I've done that, and I've met all the requirements of this. I wanted to show you one other thing. Notice that move and turn, which are here as void methods, they do not return anything back to main. So the way you call or run or invoke them is to say object name bugsy.move, bugsy.turn. But now get position returns a value back. If you remember, they told us it must return an integer back, okay, which that's how I knew to make my position instance variable an int, because I knew they were telling me that's one of the clues you have to read and infer. If they're telling me that this method is going to return an int when they give me that method header or signature line, they've told me to return an int. Therefore, I better make sure that when I create an instance variable, I've got one that's an int to go back, not a string, not a boolean, not a double. It's got to be an int. So that's where you kind of have to start reading between the lines. You have to look at the header signatures of these methods they're providing and make sure you accommodate that with your instance variables, etc. So since that returns a value, what if I did bugsy.getPosition and I don't put it in a print line statement, and I don't have it going anywhere. I don't have that value being put in memory anywhere. I don't, or have it going into a print line. So what happens? I don't get my output. I don't get a compile error. So this has more or less sort of tried to return the value of 9, but it had nowhere to put it. I didn't put it in a print line. I didn't put it in a variable. So it compiles and runs, but I can do that. I just want you to see you're not going to get a compile error. But really, if a method is returning something, I need to have a place, a holder, somewhere for it to go. It can either go into a print line or it can go into a variable of the same data type. So I can create an int here. Now again, I'm not printing that out, so you're not going to see it. But I could put it into a variable, print it out, or I could put it into a variable and do additional mathematical computations with it if I needed to. So I'm just trying to show you, you've got to have a container, a holder, something here in main to accept the value coming back, and then you can manipulate it or print it or do whatever you need to do with it. Or if you don't want to put it in a variable, you just put that right in the print line, bugsy.getPosition, and the compiler understands to print out that value. If I wanted to, again, you're going to have instances where you're going to bring it back in a variable, then you're going to use it in additional mathematical calculations. So I want to make sure you get that you have to have a memory location to hold it in your main as well. Now there are other things you can do with this code. You can, for example, some people like to make a Boolean instance variable, and we'll call it right. And so instead of direction, I'm going to leave my code in here, but you can pretend that I've deleted every reference to direction. I would have right equals true, meaning set the person to facing right. Yes. Okay. And if I do that, then I do sort of have to get a little more involved. I do have to do my if statement. And I can say if, so I'm trying to turn them. If they're facing right, if that is true, set the direction to -1, face them left. Otherwise, they must be facing left, set them to right. So if you wanted to use a Boolean, you could do that. And then, of course, your move method would stay just the same. Okay. The other thing that you can do when you're dealing with Booleans you don't have to put the equal true. If I just put right, that is by definition defaulted to equal true. So it will say if right is true, so you can take a little shortcut there. If you want to say if right is false, you can do that, or you can say take the shortcut if not true. So that means if right equals false. So that's a little tricky. This will default to meaning if right equal true. Not right means false. So if right equals false. Okay? So those are just a couple of other things I wanted to show you that you could do here. So there are other ways you could even shorten this code a little bit and do all kinds of stuff with it. But I'm just going to leave you with these ideas, and I want you to understand, one, sometimes you have to make assumptions to make your code work. And you may not make the same assumptions I make. You could have made right and left 1 and 0, and you still could have used a little more code and gotten this to work. So my point is, don't get hung up on I don't know the exact correct assumptions to make. I don't know what the College Board is expecting or my teacher's expecting, so I'm just going to freeze and not get anything done. Make your assumption, put a couple short lines of comment in so I know what they were, and get it working and move on. So you're allowed to have some flexibility in your assumptions. And make sure when you read something you do some inferring. So if they tell me that get position returns an integer, I pretty much know that somewhere I better have an integer instance variable that's tracking whatever characteristic that I'm going to be able to send back to main. If they tell me something is void, I better not put a return statement in it. First of all, if you try to put a return in a void method, you're going to get a compile error. Can't do that, okay? But you cannot say, well, I know they told me to make it a void, but I'm going to make it an int. You'll lose points on the exam for that. So if they tell you to make it a void and you understand, gosh, I could do this an easier way, and I'm going to have to create 10 more lines of code to make it work the way they want to work because now I've got to create extra methods. Understand that on the free response questions, they know you could do it other ways, but if they give you specific directions, you must follow their directions or you'll lose points. No matter how good, concise, efficient, better your solution is, you must follow along to the guidelines. So that's why we're following the guidelines that are in the written exercises of the textbook. They're very similar to the way you're going to see some of these free response for questions. So I'll leave you with this. If you have any questions, let me know, but give this a try and go ahead and submit it to the Dropbox.